marijuana laws. Governor Johnson has previously advocated the decriminalization of marijuana. It's about 50 minutes.
We're back. All right, folks, can you hear me in the back of the room? Good. It is my great pleasure to introduce our featured luncheon speaker today. Governor Gary Johnson is currently serving his second four-year term as governor of the land of enchantment, that is the great state of New Mexico. He was a successful businessman who had built a small handyman firm into a multi-million-dollar construction business before running for governor in 1994. He was re-elected in 1998, becoming the first person to ever serve two consecutive four-year terms as governor in the state of New Mexico. In 1999, when Governor Johnson first told the truth about drug policy, it sent a shockwave through the political establishment. He said the drug war is a failure and needs to end. He said we should legalize marijuana and we should decriminalize and medicalize other drugs. Well, not surprisingly, the nation's chief drug warrior at the time, drug czar Barry McCaffrey, scheduled a special trip to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to hold a press conference at which he criticized and denigrated the governor, calling him Puff Daddy Johnson at the time. And the reason the drug czar was so upset was because Governor Johnson had almost single-handedly destroyed the myth of consensus, the myth that everyone, all reasonable people, and especially all elected officials, support the drug war, and that there's no room for arguments for legalization or alternative policies. Those are marginal people that talk about that. Well, because of the governor's prestige, of the office he holds, and his own standing, he was able to break through that, to tell the truth, and in fact has become, I think, our most effective advocate. Now, as his critics were to learn, the governor is a dedicated and committed individual. He believes in standing up for his principles, and he's willing to take the heat necessary to engender a public debate on drug policy. The courage and commitment that Governor Johnson has shown by speaking out on drug policies has made it far easier for other elected officials at all levels of government to begin to tell the truth about drugs and drug policy. Some of the results of the governor's work in New Mexico became apparent this spring during the legislative session when he had a package of 8 legislative drug law reform bills in a package. The Linda Smith Center Drug Policy Foundation did a survey of public attitudes in New Mexico, and they discovered that 78% of the state support the medical use of marijuana. That's terrific, and that's 5 points higher than the national average. But most importantly, they discovered that 65% of the citizens of the state of New Mexico now support decriminalizing marijuana, and that's a direct result of the effective use of the bully pulpit by Governor Gary Johnson. When the history of the end of marijuana prohibition is written, and I hope that will be soon, I suspect that Gary Johnson's courageous public stand to end the drug war will be seen as the beginning of the official peace movement in this country, the new anti-war movement, a movement that will eventually lead us out of this quagmire called the war on drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to a statesman who did what was right, and in so doing, forever changed the drug policy debate in this country, Governor Gary Johnson.
Thanks. Very nice. Thanks. I wanted to let you know that I've got a great wife, Dee, who's come along on this trip. Thank you, Dee, for coming along. Also wanted to let you know that we have a couple of really great kids. Our son Eric is a freshman at Denver University. My daughter Saya is graduating from Boulder this spring, and she is graduating summa cum laude. So I tell you that hoping that you'll kind of do a brains by association deal. Keith mentioned that I started a business early on, a handyman business. I did. In 1974 in Albuquerque, I started a one-man handyman operation, me. Dee came on board, 2, and over the course of 20 years actually grew that business to employ 1,000 people. Electrical, mechanical, plumbing, pipe fitting, really the American dream come true. And I'm living proof that if you show up on time, if you do what you promised for people, if you do a little bit more than what you promised for people, that you can be successful. And again, it was really a dream come true. And since I've taken the office of governor 2 years ago, I sold that business. So when I get through being governor, I don't have to work. I'm not sure what that means, but that's like the American dream, right? You work hard, you know, you make money, the freedom that's associated with that. And I would like you to all know also that I am an athlete. It's something I dedicate myself to, is being as physically fit as I can possibly be every single day of my life. That does not hold true as I'm standing here right now, in that 3 months ago I broke my back, fractured my 4th and 5th T vertebrae running early in the morning. And what it has reminded me, and I will like to remind all of you, is that we take for granted our health every single day when we get up, and it's something that we shouldn't take for granted. And I've had that revisited, and again, I hold that very important. I'm going to come through this personally with more resolve than ever and more thankfulness than ever for my health. I've competed in the Ironman triathlon 3 times. I've competed in it twice as governor, and I finished with my sunglasses on both times during governor, which just says I didn't finish in the dark. And I aspire to climb Mount Everest when I'm through being governor. 2 years from today, I intend to be on that mountain, hopefully summiting about 4 weeks from now, 2 years from now. Politics. I had never been involved in politics prior to becoming governor of New Mexico. I actually New Mexico is a state that's about 2-to-1 Democrats versus Republicans. I'm a Republican. I went to the Republican headquarters, said that I was going to announce my candidacy for governor. They told me that, hey, we like you, we like what you're saying, but you need to know that you will never get elected. It's not possible. You can't come from completely outside of politics and get elected in this state to the governor of the state. Well, it actually did happen. And why? Why would I get elected? I mean, just for a second. Why would you vote for somebody who's never been involved in politics before? Why would you vote for a triathlete business person who's promising to bring a common sense business approach to state government, who's promising to put the issues that should be on the front burner regardless of political consequence? Why would you vote for somebody that's saying that? Well, maybe because you actually thought that that person might do that. All right? And then if you think about that a little bit, all right, somebody that's going to put the issues that should be on the front burner regardless of the political consequences, think about that. Hey, you vote for somebody like that, and this guy is going to make me really mad at some point. I'm going to make everybody in the state really angry at some point. And I have succeeded in that, all right? Completely. I have always believed that politics is a high calling. So this is something that I wanted to do with my life. I've been given that opportunity. I have this greatest fear of leaving office thinking coulda, shoulda, woulda. And again, so I'm doing what I think is right. I also understand in this political process that you would have thousands of New Mexicans line up to say that I've just been the scourge on New Mexico. But that's the environment. That's the political environment. But again, I've been given this unique opportunity, and I want to make the most out of that opportunity. United States of America. I mean, what is the United States? What is it? What is the United States? It's life, it's liberty, it's the pursuit of happiness, right? I believe that government has a role in ensuring life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government has a role to make sure that there's a level playing field so that everybody has access to that American dream. And what is it that we're all after in life? I mean, period. What are we after? Happiness. Anybody dispute that? You know, we want happiness. And what is fundamental to happiness? Fundamental to happiness is freedom. The ability to choose, the ability to make decisions, the ability to be whatever it is that you think you might be able to be. And again, government has a role in all this to ensure that everybody has an equal access to the freedoms that we do have. Again, I'm going to argue that the biggest success that I've had as governor is that I've put the issues that should be on the front burner, regardless of the consequences. So in New Mexico, when I took office, I think we were too high a tax state. We were like the third highest tax state in the United States as a percentage of income. Today, we're 13th in that category. We still are taxed too heavily, but we've made improvements in that area. In the area of highways, we're building 500 miles of new four-lane highway in the state of New Mexico. We received an award in Washington for putting more dollars, for ratio-wise, putting more dollars into asphalt than any state in the United States. That's a pretty good award, I think. And that's what it's supposed to be about. Best product, best service, lowest price, right? I mean, that's prisons in New Mexico. We had a problem with prisons in New Mexico. We were housing about 600 prisoners out of state. The courts, federal courts, were running prisons in New Mexico. It was a huge issue. It was an issue that required us building a couple of prisons so that we could at least get our prisoners back in state. Big, huge issue, something that needed to get addressed. I addressed it. We reformed Medicaid in the state of New Mexico. It was out of control. We implemented a managed care health care system. I'm going to argue that we're delivering better health care to those individuals on welfare in New Mexico. I'm going to argue that. We reduced the size of government, and if we're doing more work than what we were doing before with fewer employees, in my opinion, that means we're more efficient, and that's good government. That's what we should be doing. And what's the definition of insanity? Well, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing day after day after day, somehow expecting different results tomorrow. That's the definition of insanity. But when it comes to education, not only in New Mexico, but I think every state in the United States, when it comes to education K through 12, I believe that all we continue to do is the same thing year after year after year, somehow expecting different results. And what we do is we just put more and more and more money into a system that by all measurements does just a little bit worse from year to year to year. I have asked that every single student in the state of New Mexico receive a voucher, believing that competition will improve public education. In my opinion, that would change education in this country. Let's make it like higher education. I believe that higher education is simply a form of voucher. It's kids with tuition dollars. Institutions are out to attract kids. And I would argue higher education in this country is the best in the world. Why can't we do that when it comes to public education? Let's make public education better. I say you do that by bringing about competition in that area. And but what's the biggest head in the sand issue that we have in this country today? Well, the biggest head in the sand issue in this country today is the war on drugs. And I suggest to you that the war on drugs is an absolute miserable failure. Again, I remind you of the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing day after day, year after year, and somehow expecting different results. That's the definition of insanity. Apparently 74%, this was a poll done about a month ago, apparently 74% of Americans believe that the war on drugs is a failure. As governor of the state of New Mexico, and I'm not the only governor, I'm one of 50. When half of what we spend on law enforcement, half of what we spend on the courts, and half of what we spend on prisons is drug-related, is there a bigger issue? I don't think there is a bigger issue. We're spending $50 billion a year on this war on drugs. $50 billion a year. If there is one thing that I would like you to take away from my talk here today, it's the following. Don't do drugs, all right? Don't do drugs. You're looking at somebody who hasn't had a drink of alcohol in 13 years. And not only don't do drugs, but I want to make a pitch to all of you to stop drinking. For those of you that drink even a few drinks a day, until you quit, do you really understand what a handicap that is? And I've done that, and I understand what a handicap it is, and I guarantee you I wouldn't be getting up at 4:45 in the morning working out every single morning if I drank. I've found that to be a tremendous handicap. And if any of you are smoking, cigarettes that is, I would ask that you stop smoking cigarettes. There's just nothing redeeming in it whatsoever. Nothing redeeming. Stop smoking cigarettes. It's a real handicap. But is anybody sending a positive message when it comes to drugs? Is anyone? Teachers, law enforcement, elected officials, parents? I mean, no. And yet 80 million Americans have done illegal drugs. 80 million Americans. I happen to be one of those 80 million Americans who have done illegal drugs. 54% of the graduating class of the year 2000 will have done illegal drugs. So in spite of this message of don't do drugs, people are using drugs. And again, I want to make a pitch to you. Don't drink alcohol. Please stop drinking alcohol. Just see what happens when you stop drinking for a while. And yet, let's not forget that at one point in this country's history, it was against the law to manufacture and distribute alcohol. And I don't think for a minute that alcohol use should be criminal. I don't think that for a minute tobacco use should be criminal. And kids, you know, one of the huge criticisms is, Johnson, what kind of message are you sending to our kids here? Well, here's the message when it comes to kids is don't do drugs. Don't do drugs, all right? And right in back of that is, I hope the message that we're sending to our kids is that we love our kids. And that's the message that I hope my kids have gotten, is that I love my kids, all right? And that when it comes to educating my kids on these substances, alcohol, tobacco, drug use, that we be honest with our kids when it comes to the education of our kids on these topics. And by honest, you know, all these substances are like diminishing returns. First time you smoke marijuana, you know what? It's an okay thing. Smoke it a lot. It's an okay thing. I mean, but it's diminishing returns. The more you do of any of these substances, the less and less you actually get out of it. But we ought to be honest with our kids and tell them what these substances do. Without exception, we should be honest. And when it comes to my kids, you know, you're in a situation, don't drink, but I'd be foolish not to recognize that my kids aren't going to consume alcohol. Statistically, our kids are going to try or do illegal drugs. My message is, you know, you're in a situation where you've done drugs, where you've drank, where you're in a bad situation, and you need a ride, call me. I'm coming to get you, no questions asked, because I love you, first and foremost. And that's the message that we ought to be sending to kids, is we love our kids, all right? And then, you know, tobacco. I said don't do tobacco. The anti-tobacco people will tell us that 450,000 people are dying every year from their use of tobacco. You know, maybe that's an inflated number. That's a lot of people, but that's what the anti-tobacco folks will say. Apparently 150,000 people die every year from their use of alcohol. And that's not drinking and driving now. That's the health consequence of doing alcohol. And apparently 100,000 people die from their use of legal prescription drugs. Legal prescription drugs kill about 100,000 people a year. I mentioned that I'd broken my back. I was on Percocet for 3 weeks following the fracture of my back. And my gosh, I needed the Percocet. I mean, the pain was unbearable. I needed the Percocet. But when I quit the Percocet, I mean, this stuff had actually put clothespins on my bowels. And when I quit using the Percocet, it was 1 week before I was able to sleep again at night. And yet people use Percocet for years on end. Again, these are drugs that we need to help us through periods of time, but they do harm also. They can do a lot of harm. What I was shocked to find out was that cocaine and heroin causes about 8,000 deaths in this country every year. And I think people are shocked by that when they understand that hundreds of thousands of people every year die from tobacco, alcohol, legal prescription drugs, and when they find out that only 8,000 die from cocaine and heroin, I think they're taken aback by that they're really surprised that so few die. Well, the Drug Enforcement Administration will tell us that it's because of our policies on drugs that so few die. Well, again, I would argue just the opposite, that overdose is a function of prohibition, that an aspirin-sized dose of heroin today may give 3 heroin addicts a heroin high. That same aspirin-sized dose tomorrow may kill those same 3 heroin addicts because it's a different source, different quality, different quantity. I mean, it's prohibition that's killing us. Let's not forget that during the prohibition of alcohol, alcohol killed people. Bathtub gin, people were blinded by their use of wood alcohol. That doesn't happen. I mean, people still die drinking themselves to death, but it's a lot harder today. I mean, you really have got to work at it. Well, what substances are doing the harm? Well, clearly, tobacco's doing the harm, alcohol's doing the harm, legal prescription drugs are doing the harm. Cocaine and heroin certainly have a harm associated with use. Marijuana, I'm afraid, doesn't even make the list. No recorded death from marijuana, although I'm sure that there are a few people that have smoked themselves to death on marijuana. It's just that it hasn't been reported, but that probably has happened. And yet, in spite of these statistics, which ends you up in jail? Well, what ought to end you up in jail, I mean, if we're going to criminalize anything, it ought to be tobacco, but we've criminalized the use of drugs. We've criminalized the use of marijuana. And so there are 1.6 million arrests every year in this country on drug-related crime. Half of those arrests, 800,000 of those arrests, are for marijuana, and half of those marijuana arrests are Hispanic. Tell me that half the users of pot in this country are Hispanic. No, they're not. And the point is that these laws are terribly discriminatory. If you're of color, if you're a black apparently and get arrested for drugs, there's a seven times better chance that you're going to end up behind bars than if you're Anglo. So again, these laws are terribly, terribly discriminatory. The Drug Enforcement Administration says that drug use over the last 20 years has been cut in half. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Let's just do the math for a second. The Drug Enforcement Administration is saying that there are 14 million users in this country. I mean, and we're arresting 1.6 million people a year. I reject that we are arresting 1 out of 8 drug users in this country. I reject that. And if you do the math, if you go back over the last 8 or 10 years, we've arrested half the people who have used drugs. When you start adding up the millions that have been arrested on drug-related crime. So what do we need to do when it comes to drugs in this country? Well, first and foremost, I think that we need to legalize marijuana. And we need to look at harm reduction strategies for all these other drugs. We need to move away from a criminal model to a medical model. And when I say legalize, I don't think it's ever going to be legal for kids to do drugs. It's never going to be legal to sell drugs to kids. And it's never going to be legal to do drugs, to smoke marijuana, and do harm to somebody else. Never going to be legal, ever. You know, for a second, let's compare this to alcohol, all right? You know, you have a drink in a bar. In my opinion, that's acceptable behavior. But you have that drink in that bar and you walk out and get in the parking lot and get in a car, and whether that's 1 drink or 2 drinks, the point of intoxication, you've crossed over the line. That's criminal. If you're getting in a car intoxicated, that's criminal, and it should always be criminal. We ought to apply those same rules when it comes to marijuana, when it comes to other drugs. Doing drugs, smoking marijuana, doing harm to someone else should be criminal, and that's what we ought to be focused on. At a minimum in this country, at a minimum, we've got to stop getting tougher when it comes to drugs. It just doesn't work. This federal mandatory sentencing for nonviolent drug crime is crazy. It's insanity. What we need to do, what we need to focus on is getting tough on doing drugs and doing harm. That's what we need to focus on. Doing harm to others is going to be criminal. It always needs to be criminal. We need to protect life. We need to protect liberty. We need to protect the right to pursue happiness in this country. I know what the response is going to be, and so I'll tell you what the response is going to be. How many of you believe you should go to jail for smoking pot in the confines of your own home, doing no harm to anybody but yourself? I don't think people, everywhere I go, nobody believes you should go to jail for just smoking pot in the confines of your own home, no harm to anybody but yourself. Nobody really believes that. I mean, there are a few that do, but generally speaking, nobody believes that. But then you ask the question, how many of you believe you should go to jail for selling pot, for large quantities of pot, for selling drugs? And back to drug use, how many believe you should go to jail for any sort of drug use, again, if the only person involved is yourself? Well, generally people don't want to see you behind bars for use, and yet generally people want to see you behind bars for the sale. And that's why I talk about legalization versus decriminalization. We can't turn our back on half the problem, which is the marketplace for these drugs. And the myth of the pusher, I think there's a certain myth to the pusher. And that is that in the overwhelming instances of drug transactions, it's buyers seeking out sellers. I mean, that's the nature. And the nature, the profile of the pusher in this country is individuals who have sold small amounts of drugs on numerous occasions, and they've been caught for that. It's the mother of 3 who's knocked off a chunk of her rock cocaine, sold it for $7 to an undercover agent. It happens to be the 3rd time that she's done that. And now she's behind bars for 15 years, and her kids have become wards of the state. I mean, that's the profile of the pusher. And the largest group with regard to incarceration on the increase are mothers, and it's drug-related crime when it comes to mothers. People don't want to admit it, but most people that smoke pot like other people have drinks in the evening. Most people don't want to admit it, but for the most part, people that smoke marijuana are responsible users of marijuana. They choose when and where to smoke marijuana. They're not doing any harm to anyone else. And that's what policies in this country do not recognize. Our policies in this country have a fundamental belief that if you smoke marijuana, you belong in rehabilitation. That is the fundamental belief of drug policies in this country, when in fact, again, and I want to ask you not to smoke pot. Having smoked it and having given it up, same with drinking, but again, criminal? No, not criminal, not criminal. Is it so far-fetched to think that if we were to legalize marijuana, if we were to adopt harm reduction strategies on these other drugs, is it so far-fetched to actually think that drug use might actually go down? Well, if you look at Holland's experience, I was shocked to find out that in Holland, which I'm going to say has rational drug policy, they have effectively decriminalized the use of drugs, that Holland has 60% the drug use is that of the United States. That's with marijuana, that's with hard drugs, that's kids and adults. So Again, if you were to look at the only country in the world, in my opinion, Zurich, Switzerland, another country. I mean, there are European countries that are moving in the direction of harm reduction, but it would not suggest that use is going to go up. And when I talk about reducing harm, you know, what is that all about? Well, Switzerland has a heroin maintenance program in Zurich. You have to be a heroin addict. You get a prescription for your heroin. You go into a clinic, you ingest the heroin at the clinic. Well, you know what happens is hepatitis C, HIV, violent crime, property crime, they've all gone down as a result of these new policies. I got to meet with the chief of police from Zurich about 4 months ago in Albuquerque. The chief of police comes up to me and he said, I've been law enforcement my whole life. My friends are law enforcement. When they came out with heroin maintenance in Zurich, we, the law enforcement community, could not have been more opposed to what they were going to do in Zurich. We felt that property crime, violent crime, HIV, hepatitis C, overdose, people behind bars, all of it was going to increase with this program. He said, I am here to tell you that this program has surpassed anyone's wildest imagination with regard to Zurich is a better place to live. He said, I'm here to tell you that Zurich is a much better place to live today, that in fact we have improved on all these statistics. It's the law, Governor. Come on, it's the law. Are we supposed to not obey the law? I guess murder's okay then if you can smoke pot, right? Well, come on. Come on, murder is doing harm to somebody else. That's against the law. That ought to be criminal. It'll always be criminal. Let me give you another example, seatbelts. In New Mexico, I think most states have mandatory seatbelt laws, right? In New Mexico, we have a mandatory seatbelt law. Well, number one, if you don't comply with the seatbelt law, it's not criminal. You get a fine, you pay a fine. But what if, rather than 94% of people complying with seatbelt laws, what if only 50% of the people complied with seatbelt laws? Would the government, would legislators continue to try, would they criminalize the use of seatbelts? Maybe, in an attempt to get people to buckle up. At what point would they change the law when it came to seatbelts? When 50% of what we were spending on law enforcement, 50% of what we were spending on the courts, and 50% of what we were spending on the prisons was seatbelt related, not buckling up? Would they change the law at that point? I would hope so. Would they change the law when the police officer who pulled an individual over for not having buckled up for the third time and shoots the police officer to death because they didn't want to go to prison because of mandatory federal sentencing, seatbelt mandatory sentencing, would we change the law then? I would hope so. And you've all heard it, marijuana. Don't you know marijuana is a gateway drug? Well, it's not a gateway drug. It is absolutely not a gateway drug. Out of 105 marijuana users, one goes on to regularly to use cocaine on a regular basis. I mean, the same analogy can be held to alcohol. I mean, by that same logic, everybody that has a beer is going to end up on Everclear. Well, no, no. You recognize that Everclear is going to kill you. Understand that that's a dangerous drug. Same thing occurs with regard to marijuana. We all understand that heroin has some very bad consequences. Methamphetamine, very bad consequences. I got family members, Governor. You're talking about legalizing marijuana. You're talking about these harm reduction strategies. And there are people living in squalor. And I know of 12 kids who died from overdose. And you're talking about these strategies. Well, again, no matter what the situation has been made worse because of prohibition. 12 kids that die of overdose is a situation where the supply has changed. Black tar heroin came into a community in Texas, and 12 kids died from overdose. And again, was that a prohibition phenomenon? I think it was. New Mexico, we had a bust in northern New Mexico, 30 people arrested for heroin distribution. We braced ourselves for what was going to be a rash of overdose that weekend, and that's exactly what happened, because users didn't give up using heroin. They just got it from a different source, and it was of a different quality, it was of a different quantity, and so we had all the overdose that went along with it. Drug prohibition is what is tearing this country apart. Rush Limbaugh apparently pointed out the 10 worst laws of the last century, and at the top of the list, the worst law of the century, was the prohibition of alcohol. Why have we not made that connection when it comes to marijuana and other drugs? The whole phenomenon of kids doing drugs, of kids selling drugs, of kids having these huge quantities of drugs. The fact is that as penalties become stiffer and stiffer and stiffer for adults, kids are being made the mules, the carriers here. Prohibition is partly to blame for kids, again, doing and having these drugs. We're absolutely numb to what is happening. How many drug deaths are we going to read about? How many drug debts are we going to read about played out with guns rather than in the courts? Every single day we read about it, we see it on television. Every single day we read about it, we see it on television. Drug overdose. Drug overdose is a function of prohibition. And how many drug busts are we going to see on television where $250,000 worth of stolen goods were received at the drug house? Well, that $250,000 of stolen goods is your and my homes, of which somebody's probably being broken into right now as we're having this conference in the name of drugs and being able to pay for drugs. Significant things that have happened lately, I think, with regard to the war on drugs. The movie Traffic came out. I thought that the movie Traffic did a great job of depicting the futility of the war on drugs. If there's a criticism I have of the movie, why didn't they give just 1 minute to letting the whole country and world know that there are alternatives to what we're doing, that it isn't as futile as it sounds? If you saw recently, Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, came out and said that we need to entertain legalization as a way to deal with drug problems. And very significant, the governor of Chihuahua, Patricio Martinez, who is our neighbor to the south, border state, New Mexico, Chihuahua. Patricio Martinez 3 weeks ago came out and said, we need to look at drug legalization, that it is a viable alternative to what we're currently doing, that we have to control this stuff, we need to regulate this stuff, we need to tax this stuff, we need to get this product out from under the underworld and get control of it. It was very, very significant. The current drug strategy in this country, is reducing use. And that is a flawed strategy. And just for a minute, look, if we read in today's Washington Post, alcohol use is up in the United States by 2.5% over the last year, what would you think? Who cares? We understand that alcohol use is cyclical, all right? It's up and down, but what we care about is DWI up or down? Is the health consequence of doing alcohol up or down? Is violent crime, domestic violence associated with alcohol, is that up or down? What we're concerned about are the consequences of alcohol use, not necessarily alcohol use. Why can't we apply those same principles when it comes to drug use? Why can't we look to reduce death? Why can't we look to reduce disease? Why can't we have less drug-related crime? So in New Mexico, we had 12 bills actually that were drug-related, and my promise to New Mexicans was, you pass these 12 bills and I guarantee you violent crime will decrease, property crime will decrease, overdose, hepatitis C, HIV, there'll be fewer nonviolent criminals behind bars. We will spend more money on education. We will spend more money on treatment in the state of New Mexico if you pass these 12 bills. Some of them did pass, and I thought it was significant that of all these 12 bills, none of them died. They all were advancing. None of them had died. None of them had gone to their death as a result of a vote. But we did pass a few bills. One was to allow drug felons, convicted drug felons, to work at racetracks. Another was to offer an alternative that with 18 months left to go on a nonviolent drug offense that you would be allowed treatment as an option with the 18 months that you were left. Another one was to restore voting rights to felons. Another one was to limit liability of law enforcement administering anti-opiates. Now, I'm talking about the ability of law enforcement to be able to inject Narcan into an overdose victim. Narcan is a wonder drug, costs about $1.50, and apparently somebody can be dead on the floor. You can inject them with Narcan and they're alive. The other day I was talking to a group. Somebody raised their hand. They said, Holland is not like the United States. The police are your friends in Holland. The police are your friends. The police are your friends here. It's a fact. They are. But police have taken it on the chin because they're the ones that get stuck with enforcing the laws that we have. So back to Narcan, all right? Back to Narcan. Here is a bill where law enforcement in New Mexico, state police, local law enforcement, they're going to get instruction on how to administer this anti-overdose drug. In their minds, right off the bat, oh yeah, we're supposed to save lives. So when they show up on an overdose scene, the first thing they're going to look to do is save a life. That's the first thing they're going to look to do, rather than to put cuffs on anybody that's running around. That's the first thing they're going to look to do. And then over a period of time, the using community is going to recognize that the police are there to save your lives. So these little strategies, these little steps can change attitudes, and they can make a big difference long term. We also passed a law in New Mexico that will allow the sale of syringes in pharmacies, which does not promote the use of intravenous drug use, but it has a huge positive impact on health, on the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. Also, we passed a treatment bill in New Mexico that will allow us to spend $10 million more in New Mexico, which is about a 33% increase on the amount of money that we spend on treatment. Bills that didn't make it through and yet we're still alive were the decriminalization of marijuana, the real decriminalization of marijuana, no arrest, fine only. Medical marijuana, arguably we were just a few minutes from being the first legislature in the country to pass medical marijuana. Habitual sentencing reform, changing it to shall serve 18 months in jail to may serve 18 months in jail, giving judges flexibility where they don't have it now. Civil asset forfeiture. Controlled substance reform, which again would have mandated treatment rather than incarceration for selling small amounts of drugs. I say just say no when it comes to drugs, and I don't mean N-O, I mean K-N-O-W. And whether you agree or disagree with anything I've said here today, I'm going to end this by listing for you Johnson's 7 Principles of Good Government, which have seen me through my term as governor. 1 is become reality-driven, find out what's what, and base your decisions and actions on that. Number 2, always be honest and tell the truth. It's extremely difficult to do damage to somebody who's willing to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. Number 3, always do what's right and fair. Remember, the more you actually accomplish, the louder your critics become. Tell the truth, continue to do what you think is right. Number 4 is determine your goal, develop a plan to reach that goal, and then act. Don't procrastinate. Number 5, make sure everybody who ought to know what you're doing knows what you're doing. Communicate. Number 6, don't hesitate to deliver bad news. There's always time to fix things. Henry Kissinger said anything that can be revealed eventually should be revealed immediately. So point out your mistakes. Point out your mistakes as soon as possible. Always time to fix things. And then the last one is do whatever it takes to get your job done. If you don't have a job you love enough to do what it takes, then quit, because life is way too short. Get a job you love. Enjoy getting up in the morning. And with that, I would love to entertain any questions or comments or insults that you might have. Thanks. You want to say that?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 10 or 12 minutes, and we'd like to ask the audience if they could just to listen and allow the news media who've been covering the speech to ask some questions of the governor.
And before any of the news media asks a question, news media has a difficult job reporting this issue. This is not a soundbite issue. It really is difficult. I think from what I've seen, they've done a great job of trying to take it on, but it's a difficult one to communicate in a very short amount of time.
Governor, your views, no doubt, are not very popular within the Republican Party.
See if that works.
Okay, this works. Governor, your views obviously are not very popular within the Republican Party. Last year, after you made your disclosure about marijuana, the House International Relations Committee Chairman Ben Gilman did a 1-minute speech against you. Now, as long as a lot of people in your party do not like your marijuana views, are you going to remain in the Republican Party, or will you move on to a third party like, say, the libertarians, for instance?
Well, I happen to disagree. This is not a partisan issue. There are just as many Republicans that agree with me as disagree. Same when it comes to Democrats. I do not see this as a party issue. And in New Mexico, I will tell you that the chairman of the Republican Party in New Mexico, John Dendall, has been behind me foursquare on this from day one. And that goes for a lot of Republicans in the state of New Mexico. A lot disagree also, but again, I think it is nonpartisan, really. It's both sides. It's anybody that's in political office that's against talking about doing anything different than what we're currently doing.
Hi, Governor. You had some successes this year and some defeats on your legislation. What's your game plan next year for the remaining 2 years of your term legislatively?
Well, hopefully we revive these other pieces of legislation, and then we're open to new pieces. And one of the criticisms that we had in New Mexico is we came up with this package of bills right around January 1, and the session started January 17th. There was some criticism, why didn't you start earlier? Arguably, New Mexico is having a more advanced discussion on this issue than any state in the United States. And the fact that we had a package of bills like this that did advance, that was discussed, was very, very significant. So I'm not viewing what happened in New Mexico as a setback at all. And again, with continued dialogue that is taking place, I'm optimistic that maybe we, bite off a few other little steps.
Two questions. First is, what is your administration doing to assist DEA efforts on the border, or are you turning a blind eye to legal maneuvers to stop drugs from entering this country? And also, how do you measure intoxication in terms that you would alcohol use? We have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. That's the standard. How would you do it with marijuana?
Well, we'll talk. One of the problems today is when it comes to drug usage and drug testing, of course. Drug testing does not measure impairment. It registers the existence of the substance. I don't know what those intoxication levels would be, but I assume that they could be established and would be established. But again, the problem today is that an individual may test positive for marijuana on the job. Clearly, the individual was not intoxicated on marijuana, but in fact may have ingested it 3 weeks earlier. That's not correct. When it comes to alcohol, of course, that in fact does measure impairment. With regard to enforcing laws, I believe I have an obligation to change the law. Should we turn a blind eye to the law? No, we shouldn't turn a blind eye to the law. So we're basically maintaining status quo with regard to arrest. There is a heightened awareness among New Mexico law enforcement, but we're not thwarting the DEA's effort. It's again, it is futile. Diane Kinderwater, my press secretary, where's Diane? She had a great idea for the border. She thought that we could have 2 lines at the border. One would say pound of lesser marijuana, pound or over in this line, that we could have 2 lines. And that maybe we could have more of an impact at the border with that.
Governor, are you really planning on sailing off into the sunset when your term expires, or do you have further aspirations politically that you can speculate on?
I am living proof example of why you should have term limits. We should be electing individuals that come in and serve and then leave. And if we did that, if people came in, if they didn't have a political career to look after, then I think what we would see are people, elected officials, doing a lot more of what was right rather than what is it going to take to get me reelected. And so I certainly hope to stay involved in issues, but not on an elective basis.
Governor, you're speaking to a rapt audience of marijuana smokers. Can you please share with us your experiences with marijuana in the past and just a little background on your own use?
Yeah, who am I talking to? I'm sorry. Oh, very good. No, I've never hid the fact that I'm not unlike 80 million Americans. I mean, I have smoked marijuana. It's something that I did, and I understand its use. I understand its use. I understand the impairment from marijuana, and I can speak from that experience. I'm not unknowledgeable about this, and although in retrospect, I think that I probably wasted some time. In retrospect, not at the time, but in retrospect, I never, although I recognized that it was criminal, I and all my friends, you know what, we never did harm when we smoked marijuana, and we never thought that it should be criminal. And I'm surprised when you look back at the early 70s, I am really surprised that 30 years later, it's worse today than it has ever been. The government, when I was in high school, police officers said, if you smoke pot, we're going to catch you and lock you up. And I kind of laughed because you really can't arrest 10 million people who at that time was believed to be the regular users of marijuana every day. I changed that. I believe that the government will get around to arresting everybody at some point. And it isn't a joke. It really isn't. I mean, this is the problem that we're faced with, and there are alternatives to this. I mean, this is the problem. We are going to try and arrest and incarcerate our way out of this.
How can New Mexico do this on its own? Does this need to be done at the federal level, or can New Mexico do this on its own?
Well, New Mexico can pass laws and can choose to enforce the laws different than the federal government. Of course, there are federal laws on the books, and the federal government can choose to enforce on its own. They could always continue to do this. But New Mexico, any state, can in fact have their own initiatives.
From an enforcement standpoint?
Well, from an enforcement standpoint, New Mexico can make its own laws, and again, state police, local law enforcement would follow New Mexico law. Federal law, federal agents could come in and still enforce federal laws.
Back here, Governor.
That's my understanding.
Governor, you're an advocate of decriminalization. There are some in the pro-marijuana movement that believe that the commercial potential of actual legalization is what's going to get marijuana into the hands of responsible users. Is there a reason why you would oppose legalization?
No, I hope I've been clear on this. No, I support legalization. I think that decriminalization turns its back on half the problem. No, I Again, I'm sorry if there's a misunderstanding. I support legalization of marijuana.
One more question, and then I think it's time for us to let the governor go.
Governor, do you think that people who smoke marijuana need treatment?
Do I?
Yes.
No, back to my own use. Clearly, I did not need treatment. Now, again, there would be many that think that that is the case. No, I understand that the vast majority of people that smoke marijuana do so responsibly. That is my opinion.
Thank you, Governor. Ladies and gentlemen, in recognition of the outstanding public leadership in the field of marijuana law reform, the NORML Board of Directors has created a new award in honor of Rufus King Sr., who many of us knew, and who was a great public advocate. And the first recipient is Governor Gary Johnson. Thank you, Governor.